Alrighty, in this video we're going to talk about some common things we might want to do with Webpack in both development and production scenarios. Now, the first thing is going to be how do we get source maps. So as we can see over here, inside of my, my browser window, let's go ahead and bring that over to the side. You'll notice that my console logs are all in, like my woe right here, is all in application.js, line 44,933. Probably not ideal, because we definitely want to be able to see when our errors happen and when our console logs happen, where those things happened in the actual source code. So let's go ahead and do that real fast. Now the option is going to be called dev tool. So dev tool allows us to do eval, source map, hidden source map, inline source map, eval source map, cheap source map, and cheap module source map. So let's take a look at some of those options. Let's come over here, and the dev tool is going to be a sibling of our plugins, module, output, and entry. So I'll just put it here at the top. So I'm going to say dev tool, and let's set that to eval first. So I'll set it to eval, and then we'll do a gulp, gulp dev. And so eval is going to be the fastest one, but we're going to immediately see some issues with it. So it went ahead and compiled everything for us. And if we hop over here and hit refresh, oh, of course, for this example, I am going to change our public index HTML. Instead of loading from our Webpack dev server, since we're going to be making so many modifications to our config, I'm going to load directly off the file system. So I'm going to say /assets application.js. All right, with that done, let's go over here, hit refresh. So now we see that our source maps have appeared. We have application.js line 27, util.js line 9, and all that fun stuff. There's a problem. Let's go ahead and hit application.js at line 27, and what we're going to see here is not the actual application file that we wrote. What we're going to see is the result of the transformed application file. So yeah, we're seeing source maps, but we're seeing what happens to the source maps after they're processed by Babel and Webpack. And that's probably not what you want. That's probably not what you're going for here. Generally speaking, it'll be a lot easier to get actual line numbers of, or a lot better, if we get actual line numbers of the files before they were transformed, because obviously transforming JavaScript is going to change line numbers. So eval, again, is super fast. It's super fast to compile. It's super fast to recompile, but it's not going to be the best choice in a lot of cases. Now we can change that to source map and recompile. So go ahead and do that. When I recompile, I will be going ahead and pausing the video. So just a heads up. And now we got, check that out, we got source maps right there. So if we hop back over to Chrome and hit refresh, notice how we now get application.js on line 10, but now when I click on it, I'm actually seeing the actual pre-transformed code here. So that's closer to what we want, but unfortunately that's not going to be a very fast thing to do. So notice that even on such a small application, it brought our compilation from 5 seconds up to 7 seconds. So generally speaking, it's not something we're going to look at for anything but really small applications. We can even test its rebuild speed by doing gulp dev watch. And I'll pause. And then come back here and make a change to my my source scripts application.js. Clear out that line, refresh and reload. Now it's taking about 2 seconds to rebuild this. So here it took 1.6 seconds. So we're definitely getting a lot slower compilation when doing real source maps. However, if you're intending to do source maps for production, if you're intending to distribute source maps for production, I highly recommend that you would use this because it generates the best, most complete source maps out of all these options. There's another option, which is eval source map. Now, eval source map will have similar performance on the initial build, but it's going to have faster performance on a rebuild. So if I did that and then come back to application.js, notice how we still got 7 seconds there for that build. But if I rebuild, now we're down to about less than a second. So we get perfect source maps, and we're down to a second. I can prove their perfect source maps by refreshing and seeing that application.js is indeed looking at where our source code was. So eval source maps are a great choice. However, if you're even running into performance issues with that on perhaps very, very large applications, you can change this to cheap module eval source maps. By doing this, our compilation speed should be a tad bit faster in this example, but could be potentially substantially faster in a production environment or a bigger environment. So now we're 177 milliseconds. So now it's just blazing fast. But we'll notice a problem, and that is we no longer have column numbers for our errors and our console logs. So when I click on this, it doesn't know what column the console log happened on, or the error that the console log happened on, or the column that an error would happen on. Like, for example, if I generated an error right here, if I said if true, throw new error whoa, and came back here and refreshed. Did it not recompile that? Oh, of course it did. It's just I'm not loading it off of the dev server. That's a potential thing that might cause confusion. Anyway, so we reload, and now we're getting no column information here. So we're just getting if true, throw new error whoa. So we're getting line information. So we see this is on line 22, but we don't see that it's what column that actually happened on. Apologies for that. But anyway, so that is our different way to do source maps. So again, if you really, really want it to be fast, cheap module eval source map is the best choice. If you want for production, source map is the best choice. If you want for development, but your project hasn't grown large enough, then eval source map is the best choice. So it depends on the size of your application and if you're in development or production. Alrighty, so let's go back to the index.html, and I'm going to go ahead and, since we won't be talking about the performance of builds quite yet, I'm going to go ahead and go back to using this on the local file system. And I'm just going to jump into our Webpack config. The first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to refactor this dev tool out. I'm going to move it into our Gulp file. So I'm going to come back here into our Gulp file, and on our create dev config, I'm going to put in our first dev config option, which is config dev tool equals, and then cheap module eval source map. And then I'm going to remove this entry from our base config. All right, let's talk about code splitting. So let's go ahead and make it so we have a vendor file that contains Lodash, jQuery, jQuery UI, and Bootstrap. Or no, we don't want to do Bootstrap because Bootstrap is being imported directly into our styles, our site.less, so that we can use Bootstrap mixins. But we can definitely pull in jQuery, jQuery UI, and Lodash into their own modules so that our rebuilds are not only faster, but so that we only have to request those files once. Let's say we have 10 different pages and all those pages need jQuery. We don't want to re-download jQuery every single time. So to do that, we're going to put together an interesting entry point here. I'm going to say vendor is an array of all the modules I want to load: jQuery, Lodash, and jQuery UI. Then I'm going to add a plugin. So the plugin I'm going to add is a new webpack.optimize.commons chunk plugin. The first parameter is the chunk that I want to refer to, I'm considering to be my entry point for all my modules. So in this case, it's vendor. So this word right here corresponds to that word right there. So make sure they're the same. Now, vendor was an arbitrary choice, but it can be whatever you want. The next parameter is simply the name of the file I want all of these things pulled out and refactored into. So what's going to happen now is Webpack is going to output a vendor.js file with jQuery, Lodash, and jQuery UI, but then for application and contact, it is not going to load that in. So let's come back here, and let's go ahead and exit that, and do a gulp dev. And wait a year and a half. Okay, so now we can see that vendor.js was emitted and it's 1.1 megabytes. However, contact is now 778 bytes and application is now only 581 kilobytes. So if I hop over here into my assets folder, notice how there's this vendor.js file which contains my stuff, my jQuery, my jQuery UI, and my Lodash. But if I open up contact.js, check this out. It only contains our contact.js code. Do note that because we're using the eval dev tool, it's now going to, instead of outputting all of our code directly, it's going to wrap it in this eval statement. And this eval statement contains the source mapping within it. The reason for this is because it allows it to cache the source maps between builds. But this is not something you want to do in production. Again, don't use eval source maps at all in production. But anyway, so now let's load in our application. But of course, we're going to get an error. If I refresh, we'll get reference error, Webpack JSONP is not defined. Now, this error is caused by the fact that when you use the Commons chunk plugin, it takes the Webpack runtime and it stuffs it in whatever we passed into the Webpack Commons chunk. Bleh. It stuffs it into whatever we passed into the Commons chunk plugin. So we need to load that up first. So I need to say script source equals assets vendor.js. Now coming back here and hitting refresh, we now see that the runtime loaded and everything is awesome again. So we get our jQuery UI, we get our custom code, we get our bootstrap, and all that fun stuff. And if we hop over the network tab, we see that application was pulled in as well as vendor. So before we forget, I am going to get rid of that nasty error that I have printed out there. Under scripts application, just nuke that entirely. And I'm also going to jump into public index.html, and I'm going to copy and paste this as well. So when you use the dev server, you also have to reference vendor as well. So let's actually go ahead and do that. Let's see if that impacted our build speeds at all. So if I come over here and do gulp dev watch, it's not how you spell watch. That's still not how you spell watch. That's how you spell watch. And with that in place, come over here into our source scripts application and just change something and hit S, or hit Control S. And we see that we're now building at around 259 milliseconds. And if we come over here and hit F5, everything should still work, and it does. And we also connect it to the hot module loader. So yeah, so that's how you would pull things out into a custom vendor plugin or a custom vendor file. So it's very, very useful. Mostly it's useful in production because, again, if you're using jQuery on every single page, on your contact, your about page, whatever, you definitely want to abstract it into a file that only has to be downloaded and cached by the browser one time. All right, let's put together a production build and talk about minification. It's really, really easy. So I'm going to scroll down here, and I'm going to create a new function. It's going to be create prod config. I could combine these two functions as well if I wanted to, by just passing in a flag if it's prod or not, but I won't. So we'll do webpack.config clone, and then I'm going to say config. Now this is all you have to do to add in minification. So I'm not adding in a dev tool, or I could. If I wanted production dev tools, I could just go ahead and say source map right here and create production quality source map. But then I'm going to say config plugins.push, and I'm going to push a new webpack.optimize, and then it already has built in a uglify.js. So uglify.js plugin. And then I'll return config. So this is our production only configuration right here. And then I'm going to scroll up, and I'll do a gulp.task prod callback. And I'm pretty much going to take all of this stuff here. I could factor this out into its own function. I could go ahead and say function something like run webpack, and it'll take in a callback and a config. And then I could take all of this code and cut it and paste it, replace the create dev config with the config parameter. And then for dev, I can just one-line this, honestly. I can say run webpack, passing in create dev config, and then for the second parameter, passing in callback. And then for my prod, I can say run webpack, create prod config and pass in callback. So the point I'm trying to make is this is just JavaScript. If you find a way that you can make your Gulp file a little smaller by throwing in an extra function, go for it. But anyway, I can come back here now, and I'll close this out. And I'm just going to say Gulp prod. And I'll go ahead and pause the video because this might take a moment. And after 18 seconds, it worked. So it did use Uglify.js. We got some warnings. Some of it my fault. Some of it just some innocuous warnings from our loaders. But if I open up public assets, well, I can go ahead and I can just use this now directly. Or I can't because I'm not running my dev server. I do need to jump into index.html and change that. Again, the only reason I'm swapping so much between using the dev server and using my local assets is just because I'm playing around with the config so much. In a production environment, you wouldn't be doing that. Or if you were actually developing, once you get your config to work, you're going to be using the the dev server pretty much exclusively. But anyway, if I open up application.js, look at all that ugly code. Most of that is Bootstrap. Another thing that you might want to consider for production versus development builds is another plugin. And let's go ahead and take a look at that. I'm going to jump into my Gulp file. In my create dev config, I'm going to say config.plugins.push, and I'm going to push a new Webpack.define plugin. Now this is going to define constants that are available throughout the entirety of my source code. I'm going to pass in an object, and I'm going to say env is going to equal double quotes prod, or production, whichever way you want to go. And then, or whoops, this is our dev, so I'll do development. Actually, let's just use dev. Dev is shorter. And then over here, I'm going to say env equals prod. So now, there are now two constants, or there's one constant that I have access to in my JavaScript called env that's going to be defined in to our code. So I can come over here to my source application.js, and I can say we are now in env. Come back here, and let's just do a gulp dev real fast. Again, it takes so long now, but when we do the dev server, it doesn't. And now it says we are in dev, so it literally compiled that constant into our code, which is very handy if you want to do conditional logic based off environment. The last plugin I want to look at is going to be only useful in production, and that is going to be the extract text plugin. And what that's going to do is it's going to allow us to extract all of our CSS into a custom CSS file so that it's not loaded with JavaScript. This vastly improves performance, especially for large CSS files, and it also allows us to put our CSS in the header so that the CSS is loaded before JavaScript. Don't do this in development. In development, just have your CSS being printed out with JavaScript. But in production, it's very handy. So let's go ahead and see how that looks. The first thing we do is in my create prod config, I'm going to say config.plugins.push new webpack new extract plugin, extract text plugin. I'm going to pass in the name of the CSS that I want it to be, which is going to be the name of the chunk followed by CSS. So all of our chunks are going to have all the CSS extracted. Now we have a problem because extract text plugin doesn't exist yet, and that's because that's not built into Webpack. It comes from an external module. So let's install that. I'm going to say npm install extract-text webpack-plugin save dev. Now that we have that, let's go ahead and import it. So I'm just going to take this and copy it, go to the top of the file, and say extract text plugin equals require, and then we will require in extract text webpack plugin. Now there's one more thing we need to do. We need to feed this plugin through our loaders, our CSS loaders. So down here, I'm going to go ahead and say config.module.loaders at I'm doing this kind of messy. I'm just going to grab one. I'll say loader equals new, or sorry, just extract text plugin dot extract, and then I'm going to pass in the previous loaders that we had here. In this case, it's simply going to be css-loader and then style loader, or we don't need style loader in this case. And then for the next one is going to be our less, which is item 3, or 012 rather. No, less was the first one. Derp. This one is CSS loader less. We don't loader, and then this is just going to be CSS loader. For this is for 2. And now if we come in here and say gulp prod, and that certainly took forever, but if we look at our public assets, we now have, or should rather now have, a CSS file. So let's go ahead and refresh that. And we can see we have application.css with all of our CSS loaded in. So now we can load this directly. If I come back here and hit refresh, all of our CSS is gone. But if I come in here to my index.html and really quickly add in our assets application.css, come back here and hit refresh, we now have our CSS separated from our JavaScript, which is very, very, very handy. Anyway, that wraps this video up, and we'll